So one more plug I want to talk about. If you haven't already, if you're hopefully you're interested in composting if you're joining us today. But if you haven't, already seen this, I also work on another volunteer initiative called the Doug Network, DC Urban Garden Network. Every 2 weeks we do this massive email, always ugly long list of awesome workshops and programs and grants and job openings and stuff around urban ag and food security. And we have a lot of resources on our website. So check out this website if you want to learn more about urban ag. There's we put a lot of webinars up in the spring around like food recovery and around composting and things like that. So definitely check this website out and sign up for the newsletter if you want to learn more about all the great things happening in DC. Cool, but yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm gonna turn off my video, but feel free, like I said, if you have any questions, type it in the chat. So my name is Josh Singer. I'm the DC Parks and Rec Community Garden Specialist. So I work on building urban ag projects around the city, from like, community gardens to urban farms, to also doing a lot of support systems for urban ag, such as tool shares and workshops, and also our Compost Cooperative network. So we have this network of 56 compost cooperatives around the city. They're organized into basically what we call volunteer cooperatives, where community members can, we build them these critter-proof and smell-proof compost bins, and then community members can organize their own cooperatives and compost their food scraps mixed with garden waste. And we have about 1,500 people participating across the city in all of our cooperatives. But in order to join the cooperative, you have to take a training, this is going to be training, and then after this, you're done with the training, you're welcome to contact any of the cooperatives. I'll show you the links at the end, and you can join anyone's and you can help participate. And we'll talk more about how these cooperatives run. And yes, we are recording this, sending this out to everybody. So if you have any issues, or if you want to share this with anybody, feel free. We'll be sending this out probably next week, the recording. Cool, well, let's go ahead and get started. So our agenda today, we're going to talk real quickly about what is compost. We'll talk about some compost science, talk about some urban best, practices. So composting is completely different. There's a lot of practices around composting for rural areas, and a lot of people try to fit that into the urban areas, and it just doesn't work out. Urban composting is a completely different beast. So we're going to talk about best practices, specifically for urban areas, and how to not piss off your neighbors and cause rat outbreaks. And then we're going to talk about the compost cooperative model. Cool. So the point of this, we did another one of these online trainings right when COVID hit, because most of these trainings, if you want to join a compost cooperative compost cooperative site, you have to take an hour-long training, and that's done on site. But since COVID hit, we couldn't have, big meetings, and so we recorded one earlier this year, but it went pretty long. So my goal is to try to make this, a nice solid hour training that we can use for future purposes. For one, to train new members that maybe don't feel comfortable, being in groups right now with COVID, and also for old members as well. If you want to take a refresher, it's a great chance to kind of refresh yourself on how these cooperatives actually work. All right, so what is compost? So a lot of people get this confused. What exactly is compost? A lot of times we call it soil, or we're making dirt or things like that. But compost is actually an amendment for your soil. It's not actually soil. So it's an amendment that you add to your soil. Particularly if you're gardening every year, you need to add compost to your soil every year. For a whole list of different benefits. It adds soil structure to your soil. So if you have, especially in DC, if you have too much clay in your soil, which is a very common problem, it will add porosity. So it allows, increases drainage in your clay soils. If you have, sandy soils, and you add compost, it will actually help, with water retention, and things like that. It adds nutrients to your crops every year. Your crops are pulling up nutrients from your soil. So if you're not putting nutrients back into your garden's going to be less and less productive every year. So it's something that if you're gardening, you need to add every year. adds soil structure. It helps with, prevent soil erosion. It remediates your soil. So if you have any toxins and stuff, heavy metals over, many years, it will help break down a lot of these things. And it also helps balance your pH. pH is your like level of acidity versus alkaline in your soil. And that's actually, like, if anyone has done a soil test, that's like the most important thing in your garden. If your soil is too acidic or too alkaline, it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to be able to grow anything. But compost will actually allow you, for soils that are, a little bit too acidic or a little bit too alkaline, compost will actually, it creates this buffer zone that allows plants to survive and do well in those, types of soils. So compost is great, but the problem is a lot of times when a lot of people are buying compost, from hours away, and it's being shipped in these giant dump trucks, huge carbon footprint. It's costing an enormous amount of money, and it's just it's never enough compost. So that's why we created these compost cooperatives to try to help our gardens and farms in TC produce their own compost and produce it at a very high speed and a very high quality. But so that's one of the reasons why you want to urban compost. Another one is it's sending your organic scraps, your food scraps and yard waste to the dump is a leading cause of greenhouse gases. So when this is a picture of how a typical dump works, and what they do is they send all this stuff and they bury it, and then they cap it off in this layer, and that creates an environment that lacks oxygen, what we call anaerobic. And we're going to talk a lot about that. Anaerobic is a really bad compost environment, unless you're doing like bokashi or something like that, because that creates a lot of greenhouse gases like methane and stuff like that, and that is released, and that's a huge source of greenhouse gases that's contributing to climate change right now. So we want to try to prevent sending as much organics to the dump as possible. And at the same time, if you're part of a community garden, you'll know that there's always a gigantic garden waste pile that just takes forever to break down, and ends up, especially over winter, becomes like a rat hotel and stuff, and it's just bad to have these big piles sitting in your garden because it's going to attract rodents. So actually properly composting is you're going to burn through that pile really quickly, and you don't have to worry about creating rodent habitat. And it's just something that, like I said, that if you're gardening, it's something that you want to add to your garden every year, preferably a couple times throughout the year. At least every time you redo it, you want to try to add, you want to add new compost every spring. So let's talk a little bit about the science of composting. So there's a lot of different, ways that we can compost, and we actually have a lot of compost classes. A lot of them are actually recorded on a lot of really cool ways to compost as well. But we're mainly going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking about hot composting or active compost or bacterial compost. So this is basically, we're making this mixture of ingredients where we mix, carbon and nitrogen and water and air. And if we mix it just right, we're going to attract this, really, oxygen-loving, beneficial bacteria that's going to come in. It's going to eat everything up. It's going to break it down. We're going to poop it out, and it's going to be this really nice, great compost that we can, eventually put back into our garden. But it's also kind of easy to mess up too. Like if you don't mix it right, particularly if it doesn't get enough oxygen and becomes anaerobic. If anyone's ever smelled like a really smelly, like poop smelling compost pile, or ammonia smelling, that's from, it's because it doesn't have enough oxygen. So if we mess up, anaerobic bacteria, or bacteria that loves non-oxygen environments, come in and they eat it up, and instead of pooping out this nice solid compost, they poop out greenhouse gases. So all your fertility is being lost and becoming greenhouse gases. But one nice thing about this is this is a very forgiving process. So if you ever get a smelly pile, it's very easy to kind of turn it and fix it, and then the bad bacteria go away, the good bacteria come back. And it's typically a really effective way to compost. It's one of the fastest ways to compost for sure. water, especially on a small level. And it's also, it produces heat. That's why we call it hot compost, is that the more bacteria you have, the more it's reproducing, the more heat it's going to produce. And that's a great indicator of, like, if you're getting heat from your pile, you're doing things right. And if you're not getting heat, then you might need to, fix things. So that's a great way to kind of measure, your success, is how much, heat you can produce in your compost pile. And then, your piles won't get more than like 150, 160 degrees. And that's, and it may not even get anywhere close to that too for small stuff. But I mean, like in large compost facilities, if they don't manage their piles right, those piles will actually catch on fire. I mean, that's how hot this bacteria can get. And then there's a lot of other compost ways. Check out Doug Network, our webinars, and there's a lot of great courses on this stuff, but we weren't really going to talk about this stuff today. But there's like cold composting, where you, instead of bacteria breaking things down, you use things like worms, like vermicompost, BSFL, that's black soldier fly larvae. If you've ever seen maggots on your compost, and not actually maggots, they're black soldier fly larvae, and they're actually really great at composting. It's trench composting, where you just bury stuff in the garden in like a yard, and then come back next season and it breaks down. Fermentation composting, bokashi and different things like that. So definitely check out our other workshops and the webinars if you want to learn any more about that. But we're basically going to talk about hot composting today. I see this question. There's a question: how does this work small scale? Can it get hot enough if there is lower volume? Does it still work well in winter? Yeah, these are all good questions. We'll talk more about that later. But real quick, it will definitely work. Your piles will definitely. I've seen steaming piles, all throughout the winter, for sure. So this is something it can happen through the winter. It's going to happen a little less. Your bacteria slows down the colder it gets. But I've definitely seen piles, reach 150, 160 degrees with snow all around them. But if you want to get decent temperatures, you need to have at least a 4-foot tall pile, and that's why we built our bin systems that I'm going to talk about to allow that much. That's why a lot of people with tumblers and smaller systems will never get that heat, which is fine. You can still compost. It's just, if you want to produce really high quality and fast compost, you need to have at least a 3 to 4 foot tall pile. But yeah, we'll definitely get into that stuff in a second. All right, so hot composting. So what, like I was saying, it's basically just mixing, different ingredients together. And like I said, if you mix it right, you get this great oxygen-loving bacteria that will break things down and make this wonderful compost. If you mess it up, get it too wet or don't bring enough oxygen, it may not attract any bacteria, or it may attract anaerobic bacteria that can get smelly. But again, these piles are really easy to kind of fix if you do that, and we'll talk about how to do that later. But really, the 4 ingredients that you need to keep track of is green material, which is material high in nitrogen; brown material, which is material high in carbon. And just to be clear, everything has, most organic matter has nitrogen and carbon. We're just looking at things, we call green things with lots of nitrogen, like manure, and then brown things are things with lots of carbon, like wood chips. So you have your green, your nitrogen, your carbon, and then you have water and oxygen. And if you mix these 4 ingredients right, you're going to get a really fantastic compost. We'll kind of jump into each ingredient. The first one is green materials. So this is really the fuel that fuels the compost. This is the reason why, if you just have a giant pile of carbon, heavy material in your garden, that's why it can take years for that to really break down, because the bacteria is not really interested in just carbon. They're really interested in nitrogen. A great example is the Peachy County Yard Waste Facility. They pick up a lot of street leaves, and then they take them to their facility and compost them. They mix them up and water them, and it could still take close to a year to make it their finished product, which is leaf grow. If you've seen this cheap but pretty good compost at Home Depot places, that's it's made from street leaves and things like that. But they piloted this food waste program where they started mixing food scraps as a nitrogen source to attract more bacteria into the compost piles, and now they're making a finished compost in like 3 to 4 months. So that's really what we want to get to. We don't want to wait a whole year for this carbon pile to break down on its own. We want to add nitrogen to it, mix it up, attract the right bacteria, and then that's going to create a finished product, hopefully in like 3 or 4 months. But at the same time, we have to be really careful. This is the materials, green materials are the things that could attract rodents, could attract smells, could attract pathogens, things like that. So we have to be very intentional if we're going to do food scraps. And so I actually, separated the two, sections, from things that will attract rodents and things that won't. So if you're doing like a home composting and you don't have a rat-proof bin, you just want to avoid, these things. But mainly what we do, we take what's called a pathogen prevention approach, where we don't use anything that could cause pathogens, could cause really bad smells, like meats and dairies. We're mainly, looking for raw vegetable and fruit scraps are like the big thing that we want to compost. Coffee grounds as well is really great to compost. Like tea bags, if you remove the little staples, or if you don't use those fancy, poly tea bags. And then really the only dairy that we're looking for, that we allow are crushed egg shells. So we recommend you wash the yolk and stuff out first, and then break it down. And they take a while to actually break down. A lot of times your finished compost will still have the eggshells in there. But if you're a gardener, you know that eggshells are a great source of potassium. Your garden's going to love that, especially if you have like blossom end rots and different kinds of diseases like that. And then, things that won't attract rodents are fresh leaves, so leaves that are still green or still very much alive. And then fresh garden waste as well, stuff that you just pulled out of the garden is still really green. Flowers, for sure. And then hair, which I always thought was kind of funny when I read about it. But then I've met quite a few people that have dogs that shed a lot of hair, and they compost those, and that's a great source of nitrogen. The only thing about hair is it takes a little while to break down, so sometimes you gotta send it through the system a couple times. But for sure, if you have a real shaggy dog, yeah, you could definitely compost its hair. A few other questions. So another question, composting in shade. Yeah, you can still compost in shade. I recommend doing it in sunlight, just because just in case they get, there are advantages, like if you get if you overwater your compost, having it in sunlight will help kind of dry it out. But you can totally, compost is fine in the shade. And then, Abigail says, do the raw veggies include seeds? Yeah, for sure. You're going to, burn up a lot of seeds. There's going to be some seeds that would call volunteers, where you'll have a finished compost pile and you'll have some tomatoes or squash kind of sprout. If you don't get like really high temperatures for like a couple days straight, most of the seeds are going to survive. And really with like vegetable seeds, it's not that big of a deal. If I'm on a farm, like a 5-acre farm, I'm going to worry about having pure compost. But if I'm just doing a couple raised beds, it's going to be pretty easy to pick. But that being said, you don't want to throw a whole bunch of like weed seeds and invasive seeds and things like that, because that could, or grass seed, because that could get out of control. But for the most part, raw vegetables and fruit scraps, just throw everything, all of it in. And then you have some like really high nitrogen materials that you can use, but you just want to be able, you want to be very intentional about it. Like, and that's like organic manure. So you just don't want to throw a whole pile of manure in your compost pile. You want to like, intentionally mix it in the right ratios and with the right balance of carbon, or else it's going to get really stinky. And then when you want to do manure, you want to make sure it's organic. A lot of times they use herbicides that are persistent, that will survive the horse stomach, and then it'll survive composting, and then you're putting your herbicides and pesticides into your garden. So one way to be 100% sure is to only get manure from the National Park Service. So you can go to Rock Creek Park stables or DuPont stables east of the river, and you can pick up for free organic manure. Every part of the process is organic for national parks. But then if again, if you don't want to attract rodents, and like to say, if you cut your grass or your neighbor cuts a grass, bag that grass. That has almost just enough, nitrogen as manure. If you ever smelled a bag of grass that's been sitting there for a couple of days, it's just all that ammonia is coming off it, and that's just straight nitrogen. And then, alfalfa, if you ever, I've never actually seen alfalfa for sale, but more if you have any sources, or they're probably more rural farm sources, for sure. That's a super high nitrogen material. So that's your nitrogen. So we want to be careful with nitrogen, and how we're careful with green material and nitrogen is we're mixing it in the right balance, in the right way with carbon material. So the carbon is kind of the base of your compost. That's what's going to keep that nitrogen from smelling, from attracting rodents, from getting too stinky, to getting anaerobic, is having a nice mixture of carbon material. And unfortunately, this is kind of the harder part of this process. It's kind of easy finding a bunch of food scraps to throw in the compost bin. But finding nitrogen material, it can be pretty difficult, or finding carbon material, can be kind of difficult. So we always advise everyone to be on the constant lookout for carbon materials. Especially if you're like, if you have, see neighbors throwing, bags of yard waste away. If you see, wood, tree service, truck, chipping wood chips in your neighborhood, talk to them and see if you can get those wood chips. So it's just, you got to be on this constant, vigilance, looking for carbon sources. Some of the best carbon sources, this is why we partner with gardens on our compost cooperatives, is just dried plant waste. So plant waste that's been picked, and it's and then we put it in what we call a Brown's bin, which we'll show later, and just let it kind of dry out a little bit. A lot of nitrogen, escapes, and then you got a nice carbon heavy source after that. But also, like, dried leaves are really good. If you have a lawnmower, try to shred them. They compost a lot better when they're shredded. Wood chips are good. They take a little while to break down because they have that lignin, which needs fungus to break down. And you do have some of that in your compost, but your compost is mainly bacterial, so it's going to take a while to break down wood chips. Sawdust, as long as it's not pressure-treated wood. Pressure-treated wood is that wood with that green tint. It's a copper that they force under pressure as a preservative for wood. You don't want to use that because it's going to, it's a fungicide. It's going to kill a lot of your beneficial, biology. So you want to make sure, if you're doing wood sawdust, that it's from kiln dried wood. Straw, not hay. So the difference between that is straw is a grain that's grown like barley, where, you have these stalks and they chop off all the seeds on the top, and then there's still a little bit seeds left, but it's mainly just stalks. It's dried stalks, so it's really great, for composting. It's great to mulch your garden with. But in hay is actually, so hay's for horses, straws for people. Hay is actually, when you go to a wild field of grass with all kinds of things growing, and you chop it all down, and you actually want those seeds because they're a source of protein, and they feed, hay to horses. So if you get a bunch of hay, you're gonna, be mixing a lot of grass seed and things like that. Typically, hay is, it comes in like giant, round, bales, and then straw is typically the smaller bales. But you definitely want to ask, first before buying it, just to make sure. Newspaper is a great source. So most paper in this country uses soy ink, so it's 100% biodegradable. I would just be cautious, like fancy paper. The fancier you get, the more kind of toxic you get with your paper. And especially that glossy stuff is actually a clay-based material. It will eventually break down, but it takes a while, so we avoid that stuff. So you mainly just want to do like regular, like black and white paper or generic paper, newspapers, things like that. And that's a great source of carbon, especially if you shred paper at work. If you could take, if you're allowed to, you can take, those bags of shredded paper home, and that's a fantastic source of carbon. You want to, shred them. Even if you don't have a shredder, just kind of tear it into little pieces. Because if you throw a bunch of paper that's, whole pieces of paper, it's going to get wet and matted down, and it's going to create anaerobic environments. Dryer lint, if you're not using any kind of scents and dyes or anything toxic, it's great. Seashells, which it takes a little work, but if you're having a clam bake or something, or crawfish, whatever, you got to do a couple things really first. You don't just want to throw a bunch of lobster shells, because it's going to smell. You want to sanitize it. Whether if you have a fire pit, you can throw it in a fire pit, or if you want to like boil it, and you can even make like a seafood broth out of it, or bake it in your oven. You want to sanitize it a little bit, and then you want to put it in the bag, and then with a hammer, pulverize it, which sounds like a lot of work. You're like, why would I want to do all this? And the reality is, it's like the best fertilizer for your garden. So, and mixing that up in the compost, you're going to have amazing compost. It's got all these micronutrients and things that's really hard to get out of like synthetic fertilizers. So it's a lot of work, but it's, if you do it, you're going to have very, very amazing compost. And then wood ash, if you have a fire pit, you just want to make sure, don't do charcoals or fire starters. They have a lot of toxic chemicals. If you're just burning straight wood that you started with paper, those ashes are actually a great source of phosphorus. That's really fantastic fertilizer for your garden. All right, so like I said, carbon is really tough, can be tough, at certain times of the year to find. So it's good to kind of like identify the sources of carbon in your area. There's, tree service companies. There's a new app, Get Chip Drops. I'm sure if you're on Facebook, you've seen the ad. Actually, at first I was like, this isn't real, but I've talked to a lot of people that actually use it. It works really well. DDOT has, a wood reuse program. Doug Network's got a list of tree service companies. You can ask them, if you can get, and sometimes you have to wait a while, but they'll drop off a load. The thing about that is you have to, take their whole load. Sometimes it's like one tree grounded up, and sometimes it's like 5. So be prepared. This is what, most dump trucks at your 5 or 10 cubic yards. So if you ask for wood chips, be prepared for a small pile, but it could be a bigger pile. So just be, don't ask for it unless you can take a decent sized pile. Mills, there's a couple of wood mills in this area that do a lot of woodworking with non-pressure treated wood. Paper shredder companies, a lot of them legally have to burn it, but some of them are found ways around where they can donate it. Landscapers, for extra, landscape, material. Just make sure they're not giving you poison ivy and stuff like that. Make sure you trust the landscaper. And then garden waste and things like that. So, like I said, like keep an eye out for bags of garden waste. Grab those, take them down to your compost bin. Even if you have a lot of carbon, you'll go through this carbon really quickly. And then another thing, when you're adding things, nitrogen and carbon, you want to get it into small pieces as possible. You want to grind it up, chop it up, and you use a lawnmower, a wood chipper, because the idea is like the smaller pieces, the more surface area there's going to be for bacteria to come in and break everything down. So the more, smaller the pieces are, the just like, quicker you're going to compost, and the hotter your compost is going to be, because it's going to have more room for bacteria and the higher quality compost. So try to, don't just throw a whole watermelon in there. Chop it up into little pieces first. And then there's materials to avoid. I always avoid and then use moderately. So always avoid plants with diseases. Plants, invasive plants with lots of seeds, weed seeds, dairies, animal products, pet waste, poison ivy, pesticides. Things like that. And then there's a lot of organic amendments like bone meal and fish fertilizer. You just don't want to dump all that into your compost, because it's going to make it really smelly. And even if rodents can't get into your compost, they'll still hang around your garden. So I would avoid that stuff. And then there's things that you can use moderately. If you want to, like if you have a stir fry, I wouldn't throw a whole stir fry in there, but if you have some leftover pieces, that's fine. Breads and grains and rice, you don't want to fill the whole bin up because it'll get moldy and nasty, but it's fine to throw a little bit in there, and as long as you're mixing it up with everything else. Citrus and pine needles, they're really acidic, so you don't want to do a whole compost bin of pine needles, but it's fine to mix that up with normal stuff. Spent grains, if you're a brewer, you want to be careful. Spent grains are basically when you make beer, you like boil hops and for the aromas and stuff, and then what's left of the hops is called spent grains, and you can't do a whole lot with it. You want it's fine if you got a home brewer that wants to throw some spent grains in, but we have a lot of like breweries in the area that we'll probably approach you and be like, hey, can I drop off my spent grains? Say no, even though it looks brown, it's very high in nitrogen, and if you're not really intentional, I've seen it like overcome, just destroy compost systems and just like make these nasty smelly situations. And then compost bags, if you're using these are like corn plastic bags. They do break down over time, but you want to open them up and tear them into little pieces and drop it off in the compost bin. You don't just want to throw the whole bag in there, because then it's going to create these anaerobic pockets. As everything else is breaking down, you're going to have these little nasty pockets. So you want to open up these bins, drop them in, and then rip it up in little pieces and throw it in. So we have a question. What about lees from wine? I don't know what lees are. Or chunks of fermented fruit. Yeah, anything fermented, you could for sure throw that in there and mix it up as well, and that's fine. Again, that would be a moderate. You wouldn't want to throw a whole bunch of fermented stuff in there, but as long as it's just a little bit at a time, go for it. Because that's what a lot of people, when they do bokashi composting, it's a fermentation process, and that compost things halfway, and then they throw the rest of it in their compost bin. So it's very similar to that. All right, and then we have things to avoid, like tomato diseases is a big one, like different wilts and blights, and we can go in pretty specifically about what to look for, but mainly what I tell people, if your tomato dies in like July, throw that in the trash. But if your tomato dies in like now, after the first frost, it's fine to compost. And a lot of times you'll see, an early blight, which is when your bottom leaves start to get yellow, and that's typically that's a mild blight. Most people have that in the soil, so a lot of people will compost that anyways. But if you're worried about it, you just throw that stuff away. Really, it's up to each site. But if you have a tomato plant that dies from disease in the middle of the summer, you want to just throw that away, because a lot of tomato disease and some blights, they survive really well in compost and soil, and then they'll reinfect things, year after year. So that's another reason why, when you're a gardener, you want to rotate your crops every year, so just in case there's any leftover diseases, they don't reinfect things. So a couple more questions. What about compostable food containers from takeout? Yeah, tear those in little pieces, because even though they're compostable, they take up forever to compost. And even like the compostable like silverware or I don't know. It's a lot of this is site by site, but I didn't take those because it would just be too long to compost. But the compostable trays, I definitely tear that in little pieces and throw it away. Throw it in the compost bin. So I did not know you can bokashi that way. I thought you had to bury it to keep it from stinking things up. No, bokashi, you do it in buckets. And it's in a sealed fermented area. You basically ferment your food first, and then you compost it. What about squash boring worms and zucchini and squash plants? No, those things aren't going to survive in the compost bin. So yeah, you can throw all that stuff away, or you could throw it in the compost bin. Leaving leaves on yard versus putting in the compost. Yeah, the thing is, if you want to fertilize your yard, you don't just want to leave your leaves on your yard. You want to run them over with a mulching lawnmower, and that's going to fertilize it. Or you can bag it, and then or if you don't have a lawnmower, I would recommend just raking up all your leaves and just putting it in like a Brown's bin and letting it kind of break down a little bit, and then mixing it with your compost. All right, and if you do want to compost things you're not sure about, one is make sure you have a thermometer, and you want to get decent temperatures, at least 135 degrees for a couple of days at least, to kill things. But that's hard to do on small scale composting systems. So that's why we kind of tell people just do just avoid, disease things. But if you really want to, be zero waste, another way you could do is throw stuff in a black trash bag, let it, hang it in the sun for like a couple weeks, and it's going to actually solarize it and bake whatever in there, and then you can compost it. That's a lot of times why you see farms with black plastic over their fields in the spring and summer, and sometimes that's to warm up the soil, but sometimes that's to kill diseases that they have the year before. So it's a very similar concept. All right, so we have your carbon material, your nitrogen material. So now we're going to talk about the last two ingredients, oxygen and water. So the oxygen, the bacteria that we want, likes oxygen. It's going to survive really well in oxygen environments. And that's one of the reasons why we termed compost. We kind of flip it over. We have a tumbler, we mix it up. That's going to allow, bacteria to get in there. But then, if it's, but you have to be very, very intentional about this, especially like with the water, or we'll talk about water in a second. But, and there's also other ways to add oxygen. There's active and passive aeration. There's Peter Moon, he's a guy up in Washington, designs these, what are called O2 systems, where he actually has like blowers that will, and pipes that will actually blow oxygen into the compost pile. And he makes these amazing composts in a month. You don't have to turn it. It's really great. It's just, it's all prefabricated and costs like, like $5 grand or something like that. So it's, if you have the money, Peter Moon systems are awesome. But what we do in our bin systems, and I'll show this in a second, is we use what's called passive aeration. And that's basically the floor of our compost bins are paper stones off the ground, and we're spaced out with screws. So there's actually, air that comes that as the pile heats up, it actually sucks up air from the bottom and actually oxygenates the pile itself. You still have to turn the compost, like we're still turning the compost at least once a month, but that allows it, to keep everything pretty aerobic. And we'll talk more about the compost design in a second. And then the last ingredient is water. This is what you have to be careful about. If you add too much water, it pushes out the oxygen and creates anaerobic environments. And that's really what tracks that bacteria, the anaerobic bacteria that basically poops out your fertilizer as greenhouse gases. So you want to make sure you want to get a consistent moisture level. People talk about how you want your compost to feel like a wrung out sponge. This is why it's hard to do this with pile systems, because it's really easy to overwater and all the water hangs out on the bottom. That's why with our bins are actually off the ground and they have drainage. So you can never really overwater our compost. But the idea is you want to water compost once a week if possible. I know most of our sites probably water it once a month, during the workday. And the idea is, give it, if you got a hose, give it a couple minutes of spray. If you got, watering can, give it a couple watering cans, and you want to just keep things moist is what you're going for. Again, if it's too wet, it's going to, create anaerobic environment. So be careful about that. All right, so I see a couple questions. Will you be sharing the presentation? Yeah, I could definitely share the presentation for sure. And I'll send that out to everybody. Do you recommend using compost mixer at home? Like for example, Vitamin has a small home composting mixture. I'm not really sure what a composting mixer is, but yeah, anytime you can mix things up really well, I definitely recommend that. Even if it's your browns, like you're mixing up your browns or mixing up your stuff, mixing is great for compost. So if it's mixing it, yeah, for sure. All right, so now we're going to talk about a couple best practices for urban composting. So we really want to be careful about rats. So there's multiple species of rats. Some of them, dig holes and can burrow underneath compost bins. Some of them can, squeeze. They could dislocate their shoulders and squeeze into a half-inch hole. And some of them can climb, up and over your compost bin. So that's why we actually worked with this organization, Urban Farm Plants, to design this what we call the Compost Knox, that prevents rats and mice. At this point, we did some mouse retrofits, but prevents rats and rodents from burrowing underneath your compost bin from squeezing into the holes or from climbing up and over. These are the ones, we have 56 of these compost bins throughout the city. And we use things like hardware cloth, which is like super duper chicken wire that rats and mice can't squeeze into, and they can, can't chew through. Hopefully, they don't learn to chew through someday. But we have a floor. The floor is made out of paper stones. So that way, if it's made out of wood, the compost is eventually going to rot the wood floor out. So having paper stones, that means that it's never going to rot the bottom. And we space the paper stones out with little screws in between, so that allows drainage to happen. And then we have what we call fascia boards. So when we staple these the hardware cloth to the bin, the rats could kind of prop open the sides. So then we screw in fascia boards at the edges of each hardware cloth, so they can't open up the squeeze through the hardware cloth. So a couple more questions. Should I leave my bin open for the winter and allow the snow to keep it moist? No, keep your bin closed for sure. If you want to add moisture, definitely just add, from a watering can. Or a lot of people just take the winters off too, because you can still compost over the winter, but it kind of slows down. So a lot of our cooperatives will actually close down for like January, February. But yeah, you don't want to leave a bin open, because then that, rodents, especially in the winter, because rodents are looking for warm places to hide. So you want to keep it, rat proof. I want to know how the turning happens. Yeah, we'll talk about the turning in a second. Yeah, I mean, if you close down in the winter, a lot of places will either, either throw their food scraps away or find paid services, or, DPW has, farmers markets pickups and things like that. So, and then there's other features that prevent odors. So this is my favorite part of this compost bin is it's off the ground and it has drainage. Because of that, compost holds on to the moisture it wants, and then will release the excess moisture. So with these bins, it's really hard to overwater, and it's really hard to make smelly compost. If your compost does smell, it's usually because the cracks get clogged. That's why we encourage every time you turn your compost to take a stick and scrape out the cracks and make sure you have good drainage. And these are the screws. This is before we lay the paper stones, and this is how we space out, to ensure there's drainage. But having a compost off the ground, having lots of air on the sides, having these huge hardware cloth sides, really reduce the amount of smells as well. And then having these slats, even though they seem weird, they're really great when you're composting, because if you just have a door and it's full of compost and you open it up, that compost may all fall out. But these you can adjust, if you're turning compost from one bin to another, you can slowly, adjust it, raise and lower the slat height to kind of go with, if you mix, turn the compost. It may seem, weird, but when you're actually doing it, it's a really fantastic feature. So if you're building your own compost bin, I definitely recommend, using slats. So this is our Compost Knox bin. It's been built to to last 10 plus years. It's really fantastic. It is a little pricey. It's about $1,000 in materials, and then it's a lot of labor to put it together. So that's why we have them around the city, that people can join as cooperatives. So 3-bin system. This is actually my favorite way to compost, because you never have to stop. You can just continue with composting. If you're just in a 1-bin system, where you just have one pile or one tumbler, once you fill that up, then you got to wait like a month or two for it to kind of break down before you can start adding stuff up. With this, you have one bin is designated as the food scrap, the drop-off bin. So that's bin 1. And then bin 2 and 3, you never add things to these bins. These are just for cooking the compost and the whole process. Because with compost, it goes through this procedure of it has different levels of bacteria that come in based on different temperatures, and then it's this whole delicate process. And if you add food scraps, every week, you're basically hitting the reset on that process. So instead, you want to kind of, when you want to build your pile up, build like a 3 to 4 foot, tall pile, And then, because it's going to be slowly breaking down on its own, but then from there, you want to kind of move it, once you have a decent sized pile, then you turn it to bin 2, and then you just let it sit there. And then it's going to do its processing. It's going to heat up. It's going to break things down. And the idea is, and every compost cooperative is at different stages. Sometimes it takes a couple months to fill up the first bin, but ideally you want to fill this first bin up in a month and then move it to bin 2, and then second month you fill it up again, and then move it bin 2 bin 3 bin 1 to bin 2, and then you fill this bin up again, and by month 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, depending on how slow your compost cooperative is, the last bin should be pretty much done. There'll still be things like wood chips and avocado pits and corn cobs that you'll have to sift out and then throw back into the system. But for the most part, it's pretty finished compost. So let's talk about how to actually, start this out. So what we want to start out when we're actually adding compost to the compost bin. When we're actually filling up the first bin that we talked about. So we're going, how do we actually fill this first bin up? And to do that, first off, we use what's called a biofilter layer. So if you have wood chips or really chunky carbon material, we lay that out in the bottom first. And you want to make kind of like a nest, like at least 2 or 3 inches. And then we do what's called lasagna composting. So once we have this nice nest right here of wood chips and carbon material, then it's ready for someone with some food scraps to come in and drop it off. And we drop it off. We do what's called lasagna composting. This is one of the reasons why we do this is this kind of slows the process down a little bit, because especially if you only have a couple people dropping off food scraps, it can take a really long time for you to actually build up a pile, and a lot of times it will your compost is breaking down faster than you can actually accumulate. So one way to get around that is you build a lasagna composting that kind of slows things down, because really your composting really doesn't take off the whole process until you mix it up really well. So if you lasagna compost, it's going to slow things down. It's still going to break down, but just at a slower rate. It's going to give you more time to build up your pile to 3 or 4 feet, so you can mix it up and properly get the good temperatures. So you add, the idea is you add like a layer of browns, so you have your nest, and then you have someone drop off, some greens material, food scraps and stuff, and then you cover that with another layer of carbon. And we do there's a lot of different, opinions about ratios. Usually for these, we do a 2-to-1 ratio where we have 2 parts carbon and 1 part nitrogen. I don't think you don't have to, it's not exact science. It's basically, if you have a bucket full of food scraps, you want to fill up that bucket twice with carbon material and then cover it back up. And you keep on doing that until you start building up your piles. And really, so this is how it looks. Is like, so we have that nest. You drop a bunch of food scraps off in the middle, and with maybe a bucket of food scraps, and then you fill that bucket up twice with carbon material, and then drop it off on top there. And the biggest thing is you don't want to have any food scraps exposed. So that's the main thing. Like a lot of the stuff, you won't remember and you'll pick up as you're doing it. But the main thing is you want to make sure there's no exposed food scraps. Because when there's exposed food scraps, you're going to have flies, and then eventually you're going to have rodents. And even if they can't get in the bins, they're going to hang around the garden. And you really want to avoid that. So that's like the biggest one. Is you want to make sure people should never actually see food scraps in your bin. It should only just see carbon material. So that's what you can get, you can measure your ratios, but the main thing is you just want to have a solid 2 to 3 inch layer of carbon that's covering up your food scraps. So if that's 2-to-1, great. But then the main concern is just make sure everything is completely covered. All right, so a couple questions. Which bin would you add the brown material? So we're doing all of this in bin 1. And then when you move it to bin 2 and 3, if there's any exposed food scraps, you can add a little bit of carbon to cover that up, but you're basically not adding anything to bin 2 and 3. So if you have folks dropping off all food scraps in one pile and other folks will move it over to lasagna in the other bins, yeah, so essentially you're only doing the lasagna composting in bin 1. And then when you turn it, you mix it up, and you turn it into bin 2, and that's when you mix everything up, and that's where the temperatures get really, do really well at that point. All right, let's see. So, and then we have, brown storage bins. So you don't want to like look for carbon, whenever you're ready to drop off your food scraps. You want to have a brown bin. We make them out of harbor cloth, just these circle bins. And the idea is you want to mix all your browns in there, and then so you don't have to look for carbon every time you drop stuff off. You could drop your food scraps off and then grab some carbon. But that being said, if there's no carbon in the carbon bin, you can't you drop your food scraps off. You got to take it home and throw it away, or take it to DPW, compost market or something like that. And that's one. And when we filter stuff out, the corn cobs and avocado pits, we'll actually mix that in our carbon bins, because at that point, rodents don't really want something that's been kind of compost bin for 3 months. So we'll mix that up, and it'll actually pre-inoculate your carbon. But the best sources of carbon are mixture of things, so if you throw wood chips, throw plant waste, and you kind of mix it all up and let it break down a little bit and make it, the idea is you want it to be kind of like a mulch-like substance. That is like the best carbon that you can use, mixing with your food scraps. And then adding water, like I said, we need to add water, usually bin 1 doesn't need water because a lot of your food scraps have water, but you want to, ideally anywhere from once a week to once a month, you want to water each one of these bins. Give it, a couple minutes if it's a hose, or a couple watering cans. And some sites will drill little holes into the roof to allow rainwater to come in. If you do that, just make sure they're really tiny, so you don't have mice squeezing through. And then turning your compost is a fancy word for just taking a shovel or a pitchfork and flipping it over. And that's going to really, you want to do that. Ideally, you want to do that once a month, yeah. So if you do that more, you can turn it, once a week, and you'll have faster compost, but it's just a lot of work. So we figured out that, once a month is a good process for compost cooperatives. And then a lot of sites will have composting trays. A couple sites have been doing that, where they'll pull the compost out and they mix it up, water it, and then put it back into the bin. And they do that once a week. And that, just speeds up the process and makes it really nice compost, but it's a lot of work for sure. So, so if you're interested in actually speeding up the compost and you have a lot of capacity to do it, let me know, and I'll guide you through this troughs. But most of our compost cooperatives don't do this, just because it's too much work for them. And then, like I said, the composting process is really like a lot of the bacteria likes to hang out in the middle of the compost. So that's why when you mix it up, that's where, so the lasagna composting, you may get some temperatures, it may get up to 100 or so, but it's not until you completely mix it up and turn it into the next bin that you'll get really high temperatures, like 140, 50, 60, depending on the size of your pile and how well you're mixing it. And then that, but all the bacteria hang out in the middle, and then they eat up all the nitrogen in the middle. And then, after a little while, that temperature will drop back down as the bacteria leave, because there's no nitrogen in the middle. So then that's time, in a week or a month, you turn that compost again, and all the nitrogen on the outside gets mixed up in the inside, and then that tracks the bacteria back to the compost, and that brings the temperatures up. So a lot of times it's like a roller coaster, where you get really hot piles after you turn it, and then it kind of cools down because the bacteria leave, and then you turn it again and you get really big temperatures again. And the idea is you want to keep on doing this until it's about after about 3 or 4 months, it just stays at room temperature, because all the nitrogen is basically spent. And then there's a curing phase where if you don't like pill bugs, those little roly-polies, you may want to skip this stage, because at the end, the compost will be basically ready, but it'll be covered in like bugs, pill bugs mainly, and that's because they're kind of eating the last bits of nitrogen left. So a lot of times we'll sift it, we'll scoop it out, we'll make little sifters, and scoop it out and sift it into the compost. And then we'll take that leftover stuff and put it in the browns bin to pre-inoculate, your browns material. And then you're left with a pile that's, and I let it kind of sit for a week or two. That's just called the curing stage. So this is basically all the pill bugs and bacteria and stuff will just break down the last bits of food scraps or last bits of, I mean, at this point, rats and, rodents don't want it, but it's still kind of just breaking down the tiny microscopic pieces that are still left. So it's ideally you want all that stuff to break down before you put it back into your garden, because it's more accessible as a fertilizer. If you just throw a bunch of food scraps in your garden, it's not going to be accessible, and it's going to take away nitrogen and nutrients from your garden. So you want to make sure everything's completely done. So I'll let it sit for like 2 weeks, wait till all the bugs leave, and then it's ready to put back into your garden. And then we make these tumbler sifters that really speed up the process, because hand sifting, it can take a couple hours to hand sift a bin, but a tumbler, it could take 20 minutes to half an hour. So if you're interested in tumblers, we actually have webinars and stuff on how to build your own tumblers. And then storing food scraps at home, it's nice to have, yeah, you don't want to just put it in a closed bucket because it's going to get nasty. So it's nice to have these carbon filters, cans that have carbon filters that filter out the smell, so you can actually store food scraps. But that's still going to only buy you about a week. So you need to get in the process of dropping your food scraps off once a week, unless you have freezer space. And then if you store the stuff in your freezer, then you can, and then you can do it at your own pace, and you just drop off the frozen stuff, put carbon on top, and then as it melts, it will create its own layer. And you may get a lot of fungus and stuff in here. Just throw all that stuff in the compost bin. It's all going to work its way out. And then a couple of troubleshooting guides about composting. So composting, you can treat it like a science, but it's hard when it's like a community level. So we approach this as like a sensory, approach, where if it smells like, rotten eggs or ammonia, it's probably, not getting enough, there's probably too much water in there, or maybe the drainage is clogged. So you want to get in there, turn the compost, kind of scrape out the drainage, add more carbon. If you have pests, like if you see a lot of flies, flying, you want to walk around the bin because you probably have like a food scraps that are exposed. You want to cover that up with some more carbon. Or if it's just taking forever, like you're not getting temperatures and it's just taking a really long time to break down, that might mean that one, you may not have enough material, or it may not be you may need to water it more, or you may need to add more nitrogen. So a lot of our sites will actually go down to a 1-to-1 ratio. But we want people to kind of know what they're doing first. So that's why we recommend everyone do a 2-to-1 ratio, where 2 parts carbon per 1 part nitrogen. But some sites, to kind of increase the process, increase their temperatures, are going down to 1-to-1. All right, and then some of the equipment, I recommend, pitchforks over shovels. Pitchforks work way better than shovels when turning compost. It's nice to have a thermometer that can actually, a couple feet long, that actually get into the middle of the pile, so you can get the temperatures of your bacteria. They make a lot of these mixers and probes that, have, they're all right. I don't know if I would recommend them, but if you have one, you can try it out. And the last thing I want to do before I talk really quickly, so probably have about another 5 or 10 minutes. It is 1 o'clock, so if you have to leave, that's fine. I'll send you the recording, but I'll try to wrap this up in another 5 or 10 minutes. I wanted to talk really quickly about rats. This is one of the reasons why we do use these rat-proof bins, is kind of reduce rat situations in these gardens. But every once in a while, you can particularly if a bin, maybe rats can't get into the bin, or but they'll hang out around the bin because it's warm and over the winter. Or like the big problem that we've been having is these bins are heavy, so they'll start sinking a little bit, and when they sink, sometimes they open up little holes and things like that. So the main thing is you need to monitor this stuff, and if you notice a rat hole, if you notice rodents, like reach out to us, let us know, because it's super easy to take care of when we're on top of it, when it first happens. But people just ignore it for a couple months, and then it becomes this terrible infestation. And so what you want to look for are 2 to 4 inch holes. There's a lot of things in DC that will dig holes. Really small holes are like, carpenter bees and stuff. Moles are like 1-inch holes. Groundhogs are huge holes. But when you see 2 to 4-inch holes, that's a pretty good example that there's a rat. And if you have that, there's a couple things you could do. If it's on public property, let me know, and we'll bring a rat invader, come out and treat it. Or if it's private, you can call a exterminator. But if you want to just take care of it really quickly, there's a couple really great ways. If you can try these have-a-hearts cages where you put like peanut butter and stuff and try to capture them. If you do that, you got to check the cages once a day, because if they stay in that cage more than a day, they'll freak out and have a heart attack. And then what's the whole point of have a heart? But then you can also get this, if you get poison chunks, you make sure to do these like cages so dogs and cats can't get to them, so only rats can go in there. Or if you have these pebbles, what you want to do with the pebbles is you want to shove them down into the hole, at least a foot into the hole. And that way, exterminator told me once that the rats will be more responsive if it's at least a foot in the hole. If it's on the entrance of the hole, they don't pay attention to it. And then also that way dogs and cats and stuff can't get to it. One way that has been having a lot of success lately is dry ice. So you can pick up some dry ice at a liquor store or Harris Teeter and shove dry ice into the hole, and that actually creates carbon monoxide poisoning. It's a much more, humane way than poison, to be honest, taking out rats. And then you shove, in the hole, and you fill out all the holes, you cover them up, and then if there's new holes, you do that, for a week or two, and usually it takes care of all of them. There's actually like dogs, if you know anyone with terriers and stuff, they're like naturally bred to hunt rodents. But all this stuff saying, most of our sites, we've only had a handful of sites that had issues, and really, if we respond to them quickly, it's not a big deal at all. But a couple of our sites have ignored this, didn't tell anybody, and then within a couple of months, it's a big situation. So all I'm saying is, if you just be responsive if you do find these holes. So a couple questions. What about squirrels? Well, yeah, as long as the bin's rat proof, they'll definitely be squirrel proof as well. Are there rules with catch and release in DC? For sure. You're not supposed to catch and release anything, so do it at your own risk. But a lot of people still do, and they'll take it to forest or someplace like that. But technically, you're not allowed to. And I guess worst case scenario, you may get a ticket. Yeah, people still do. So thanks for that. Just being honest, you're not supposed to catch and release. Does poison pass to animals that eat rats? For sure. So that's another thing. Thanks for mentioning that. If you're using poison, most of the times when they're sick, they'll go in their hole and they'll die in their hole. Sometimes they'll die outside. So if you do put poison out, it's a good idea to walk the site once a day, just to make sure there's, if you do see a dead rat, just get a shovel and throw it in a trash can, because you don't want like a dog running around and eating it, for sure. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes talking about our cooperatives. So that being said, because a great way to talk about this, especially after talking about rats, is sometimes compost can be a lot to do on your own, especially if you're doing it in your backyard and turning everything yourself and all that stuff. We have classes where we'll talk about easier ways to compost. They're all recorded webinars on the Doug site. But this is one of the reasons why we created these cooperative networks. Is we build these really nice smell-proof and rat-proof compost bins, and then we organize people into these cooperatives. Where it's actually fun. It's actually a great way to meet your neighbors. It's a great way to compost as a group. It's not all on you. So if there's an issue, I can help. Other people can help. And we have over 56 sites all over the city. This is the map. All the green ones are active. The yellow ones, we still need compost managers. And then. Yeah, it's just a great way. You have to take an hour training, and you have to spend an hour a month kind of helping process. But the whole point is it's a cooperative. It's not volunteering. Volunteering is like, oh, I'll just show up whenever I can and pat myself on the back. No, like cooperatives are like you're a member and you have responsibilities, and that responsibility is you have to help process the compost. Or if not, like if 100 people are dropping off food scraps and only 2 people are processing, that's going to burn those people out real quickly. So you have to. This is a group effort, a cooperative effort. we're in the middle of launching this really cool pilot program where we're going to have an app that we can actually record how much, material you're composting, record, BMPs and troubleshooting guides and stuff. And it was actually going to capture stats where you can actually, we would have prizes like which site is composting the most, which members composting the most. We were right in the middle of that contract, and then COVID hit and our funds were frozen. But hopefully by next summer, I think we'll get more funds to complete that. And then really excited about this. This is going to be a really exciting way to kind of capture data and to kind of make it more tangible so you can see how much you've composted throughout the year. But cooperatives, like I said, cooperatives, they're not volunteers. Even though you're not getting paid, they're still, in exchange for dropping off your food scraps, there are responsibilities. So please don't join a cooperative if you don't want to actually help out, because that's going to hurt the cooperative. It's going to increase the capacity and start burning people out. So everyone needs to be involved when we join these cooperatives. And they're, these cooperatives are locked as well, so no one's dropping off. Because I used to do unlocked compost bins, and people would drop off diapers and pet waste and stuff. So these are locked, and you have to take a training, which this is the training you could take to actually get access to that bin. So it's a very controlled environment, so you don't have to worry about, hopefully you don't have to worry about, nasty stuff being thrown away. And then, so there's a couple, just 3 quick requirements. If you want to be a compost manager, especially on some of those sites that still need compost managers, the 3 responsibilities of the compost manager are you have to lead new trainings for people. So that's like once a month, and it's basically just kind of like what we just did. You kind of read through the documents. Now with COVID, you can actually use, I'll have these recorded webinars, and you can use these webinars to train people, but you still want to give them like a 5-minute site orientation and stuff. But and then coordinate work days. It's really recommend that you have work days, like a consistent work day, like, the first Sunday of the month from like noon to 2, everyone knows that's their work day. And you could start off just being like an honor system, but a lot of sites that will have trouble getting people to show up on work days will eventually, like I did this on my site. We had like 150 people and only like 2 people would show up. So we started, we would change the combination lock every 6 months, and we would only give the new combo to people who are showing up. And that sounds harsh, but really, because of that, we lost a lot of composters who weren't helping, but now we have this really solid crew of people of like 40 people that all help, and it's an amazing system, and it goes really well, and no one's stressed out, and no one's burnt out. So that's ideally what you're going for with these cooperatives. And then the last thing is you want to be quality control. You want to be the contact, like if there's a rat issue or if people aren't covering up their food scraps, you can email people and let them know what's, please cover your food scraps, or you can contact me if there's an issue, and we can take care of it. And then if you're going to be a member, the 3 requirements to be a member is, first one is take the training, which you just did. This counts as your training. So after this, you can reach out to these cooperatives. I'll show you a link to actually reach out. So you reach out and say, hey, I took this training with Josh Singer online. I want to join this cooperative. So you have to provide an active form of communication, and then you have to show up once a month, during the workday for 1 hour a month to help process the compost. And then some sites have so many people, like some sites have like, 100 people that are actively, that they went down to like, you have to show up every other month, so the compost manager can kind of change that. But the idea is you got to be meeting these requirements, or else, like I said, you become a burden on everyone else, and it is a way to kind of, it could be a lot. That's not to say like, and not to like, you get it. It's just like everyone needs to kind of, help a little bit instead of a few people doing a lot. And then also, if you want to outreach and if you need more members, here's a flyer you can use, to outreach to, local listservs, next door, things like that. It really helps to kind of get the word out, put up flyers, because the more members you have, the more your higher quality compost you're going to be able to produce. So someone had a question, can a member be a member in Fairfax, Virginia? Yeah, you can for sure, if you live outside DC, you can still join one of these as long as you're meeting the requirements. That being said, if it's like an hour-and-a-half drive, you may not, last the work, so think about, how far you really want to, what's really reasonable for you. And then the last slide, so these are where some links. In a second, I'll post the link to these resources, but if you want to screenshot this, or basically this is the link where you find the map of all the compost cooperatives, and you click on which one site's closest to you, and there'll be a contact info for the manager. Reach out to the manager, say, hey, I want to join, and then sometimes it takes a week or two because these are all volunteers, but eventually they'll respond and work with you, or if they don't, let me know and I'll help them. Maybe they're on vacation or something like that, or they don't see your email. And then there's a Google group if you want to share questions. There's a Facebook if you want to share photos of the things happening. The Doug newsletter we talked about if you want to learn about new compost trainings. There's a webinar. That's the old webinar. I'll be updating it probably with this new webinar. And then the managers will have a folder full of training materials and carbon contacts and stuff like that. So if you're a manager, just make sure to get the Google folder. All right, so I only have about 2 minutes left. I apologize, I'm on a tight schedule, but if there's any couple quick questions if anyone want to ask. So Alex asked, what is Montgomery County's involvement? I don't know what's going on in Montgomery County, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to help set up these compost cooperatives outside the city. Let me get the. I'm going to post in the link to this website in the bottom. So if anyone wants the PowerPoint or the slides, it's on this Google Drive down here. And sorry to be in a rush, but I do have a 1:15. So if you have any further questions, feel free to email me anytime. If you feel good to go, check out that website. Here, I'll post the link to that website. Check out the website to find the nearest cooperative and reach out and let them know that you just took the training and you're interested in joining. But other than that, yeah, sorry, I felt like it's a little rushed, but yeah, I gotta go. I have a 1:15 meeting, but yeah, feel free, please, reach out to us. I'll be sending the recording out to everyone registered as well. So if you came in late or you didn't capture anything, or I just was incoherent, I'll send the recording back out to everybody, as long with the links to the PowerPoints and everything. Cool. I'm sorry, y'all. I gotta go, but thank you all so much for attending, and hope to see you all in this crazy compost world. All right. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.